Bet Daddy stole it from a pawn shop. He held her father's watch above his head, laughing, while the whole diner watched and said nothing. Then he let it drop. Silver hit tile. Glass cracked. Nobody moved. Grace knelt down, picked it up with both hands, stood back up. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that only the nearest tables heard her. "You still have a chance to step back from this. I'd take it, if I were you." Brett Calloway laughed again. His father owned half that town. Nobody had ever made him step back from anything. But the retired police chief in the second booth wasn't laughing, because he'd just watched a small-town waitress absorb a public humiliation without a single flicker of anger. And in 32 years of wearing a badge, he'd only seen that kind of stillness in people trained to survive far worse. Every town has a place where people go to feel normal again. In Millbrook Falls, that place was Rosie's Diner. It sat on the corner of 5th and Elm, under a red neon sign that buzzed a little too loud after midnight. The coffee was strong, the pie was better, and the people who walked through that door knew each other by name. This is a story about one of those doors, about the morning it opened for a young woman named Grace Doyle, and about the evening, weeks later, when everything the town thought it knew about her fell apart. It is also a story about the rest of us, about how easy it is to sit in a booth, drink our coffee, and say nothing while someone gets treated like they don't matter. Most of us have done that at least once in our lives, watched something unfair happen, and told ourselves it wasn't our place to speak. This story asks a simple question. What does it cost a town when good people choose silence? And what does it take to finally break that silence, once and for all? Some people walk into a small town like they've never had a past at all. Grace was one of them. Quiet, careful, polite to a fault. For 3 weeks, nobody in Millbrook Falls asked her a single question she didn't want to answer. That was about to change. Because sometimes the past doesn't knock. It just walks in behind you and waits for the right moment to sit down. Millbrook Falls was the kind of town that still had a 4th of July parade down Main Street. The kind where the barber knew your father, and probably your grandfather too. Farmland stretched out past the edge of town in every direction, gold in late summer, gray in winter. There was one grocery store, one hardware shop, one diner that mattered. Rosie's had been open for 31 years. Rosie Hendricks bought it from her own mother, back when the booths were orange instead of red. She was 68 now, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with hands that never seemed to stop moving. She knew every regular's order before they sat down. She knew who was going through a divorce, who just lost a parent, who needed a second slice of pie and wouldn't ask for it out loud. Running a diner in a small town isn't just a job. It's a kind of ministry. You feed people. You listen. You remember their names when the rest of the world forgets. Rosie understood that better than anyone. She used to tell her late husband, back when he was still around to hear it, that a diner counter was the closest thing this town had to a confession booth. People said things over pie they'd never say anywhere else. And 3 weeks ago, she'd hired a new waitress. Grace showed up on a Tuesday morning with a worn duffel bag and a resume that was thinner than Rosie would have liked. No references from the last 2 years. No explanation for the gap. Most owners would have said no. Rosie looked at her for a long moment instead. There was something in the way Grace stood. Still, balanced, like she was used to waiting for permission that never came easily. "You ever waited tables before?" Rosie had asked. "A long time ago," Grace said. "I learned fast." That was all she offered. Rosie didn't push. She'd learned over 3 decades that some people needed a chance more than they needed an interview. She hired her on the spot. 3 weeks later, nobody in town could say they truly knew Grace Doyle. They knew she was 25. They knew she rented the small apartment above the old feed store. They knew she arrived 20 minutes before every shift, apron pressed, hair pulled back tight. They knew her orders never came out wrong, not once. What they didn't know was why she always took the booth near the kitchen door when her shift ended, the one where she could see the front entrance without turning her head. They didn't know why her eyes moved to the door every time the bell above it rang, checking, then relaxing, then checking again. They didn't know about the thin scar along her left forearm, hidden most days beneath her sleeve. They didn't know about the silver pocket watch she kept in the front pocket of her apron, wrapped carefully in a folded napkin, like something fragile that had already been broken once. Small towns are patient, though. They don't demand your story all at once. They just wait for it to show itself. And on a Thursday morning in early October, something started to show. Frank Merritt arrived at Rosie's diner at 6:15 every single morning. Had for 11 years, since he retired as the town's police chief. He was 74 now, broad-shouldered, silver mustache, the kind of man who still stood up straight out of habit rather than effort. He ordered the same thing every day. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, no cream. He sat in the second booth from the window where he could watch Main Street wake up. Frank had spent 32 years wearing a badge in this town. He'd broken up bar fights, talked down angry husbands, driven lost teenagers home instead of writing them up. He'd learned over all those years that you could tell almost everything about a person by watching how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them. The waitress, the janitor, the new kid nobody bothered to learn the name of yet. Frank had been watching Grace since her first week, not suspiciously, just carefully. The way an old cop watches everything, out of habit, long after the badge is gone. He noticed she never let her back face the door. He noticed she scanned every new customer for exactly 2 seconds before returning to her work. He noticed the way she carried a full tray, weight balanced low, steps quiet, like she'd been trained to move without drawing attention. Frank didn't say anything about it. Not yet. He just filed it away, the way he'd filed away 1,000 small details over 3 decades of police work. Some things you don't ask about. You just wait and let the truth choose its own moment. That Thursday, the bell above the door rang at 11:40, right in the middle of the lunch rush. Rosie glanced up, and her jaw tightened just slightly. Frank saw it too. He set down his coffee. Brett Calloway walked in first, like he always did, like the room belonged to him before he'd even ordered anything. He was 29 years old, tall, well-dressed in a way that cost more than most people in that diner made in a week. Behind him came 3 friends. Same age, same swagger. Everyone in Millbrook Falls knew the Calloway name. Brett's father, Thomas Calloway, owned half the buildings downtown and had his name on the plaque outside the community center. His construction company had built the new school gymnasium. His donations kept the volunteer fire department in new equipment. People in this town said thank you to Thomas Calloway a lot. They said it because they needed to. And Brett had grown up learning exactly what that gratitude was worth. He'd learned that doors opened easier for him, that mistakes got quietly cleaned up, that apologies were something other people offered him, never the other way around. He took the corner booth without being asked, boots up on the bench across from him, like the diner was an extension of his living room. "Where's the new girl?" he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. Grace was already walking toward the table with 4 waters on a tray. She set them down without a word. Careful, even. Not a drop spilled. "You're slow today," Brett said, watching her. "I just started my shift," Grace said quietly. "I'll have your order out fast." "That an excuse?" She didn't answer that. She simply asked what they wanted to eat. One of his friends laughed under his breath. Grace wrote the order down, turned, and walked back toward the kitchen. Frank watched all of this from his booth, saying nothing, jaw set in a line he hadn't used much since he traded his badge for a fishing rod. He'd seen men like Brett Calloway before. Not the name, the type. Men who had never once had to earn anything, and mistook that emptiness for strength. They usually found out the hard way, eventually, that the world doesn't actually work like that. Frank just hoped, watching Grace disappear into the kitchen, that this town wouldn't be the one to teach him. The morning went on the way most mornings did. Farmers came in for coffee before heading to their fields. A young mother wrangled a stroller through the door, apologizing for the noise, and Grace waved her off gently, telling her the diner had heard worse than a fussy baby plenty of times before. 2 retired school teachers argued about a crossword clue in the corner booth. Grace moved through it all in her quiet, precise way, refilling cups before they were empty, remembering who wanted extra ketchup without needing to be asked twice. She was good at this job, better than good. There was something almost meditative in the way she worked, like the rhythm of carrying plates and pouring coffee gave her a kind of peace that the rest of her life didn't offer. She'd told herself, more than once since arriving, that this was exactly what she needed. Simple work, small kindnesses, nobody asking her to be anything other than fast and polite. Then Brett's coffee cup went over. It happened fast, the way these things always do. Grace was walking past the corner booth with a full pot in her hand, and Brett shifted his leg out into the aisle at exactly the wrong moment. The pot didn't spill. Grace caught her balance instantly, a small, practiced adjustment of her hips that kept every drop inside the carafe. But Brett's own cup, the one already sitting on the table, tipped over from the jolt of his leg hitting the booth. Coffee spread across the table and onto the floor. "Look what you did," Brett said, standing up fast, voice sharp enough that conversations nearby went quiet. "I'm sorry," Grace said, already reaching for a towel from her apron. "I'll clean that up right now. You spilled coffee on me." He hadn't been touched by a single drop. Everyone in earshot could see that. But nobody said so out loud. That was the first lesson Grace was learning about Millbrook Falls and about the Calloway name. People here knew the truth. They just didn't always say it. Grace knelt down and wiped the floor, calm, methodical, not rushing, not flustered. Brett stood over her the whole time, arms crossed, clearly enjoying an audience. "This is what happens when you hire people who don't know what they're doing," he said, loud enough for Rosie to hear from behind the counter. Rosie's knuckles went white around the coffee pot in her hand, but she didn't move yet. She'd learned the hard way that stepping in too fast with a Calloway could cost her more than a bad review. Grace finished wiping the floor and stood, towel folded neatly in her hand. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, voice level. Brett looked at her for a long moment, like he was deciding whether her calm was an insult or an invitation. It was neither. It was simply the only way Grace knew how to survive a moment like this. But Brett didn't understand people who didn't flinch. He'd spent his whole life around people who flinched, and something about her steadiness itched at him in a way he couldn't quite name. "You know what?" he said. "Give me a new coffee. And this time, don't spill it on yourself trying to be dramatic about it." Grace nodded once and walked away. Frank watched her go, watched the careful way she kept her shoulders level, her breathing even. He'd seen people hold themselves together like that before too. It wasn't calm exactly. It was control, the kind you only learn if you've had to use it before, in places far worse than a diner. Grace came back a few minutes later with a fresh cup of coffee. She set it down gently in front of Brett. That was when he noticed the chain. A thin silver chain hung from a small pocket on the front of her apron, disappearing inside. "What's that?" he said, reaching for it before she could step back. "Please don't," Grace said. And for the first time that morning, there was an edge underneath the calm. It was too late. Brett had already pulled. A pocket watch came free of the apron, silver old, the surface worn smooth from years of being held. He turned it over in his hand, ignoring the way Grace's whole body had gone rigid. To Doyle, he read aloud, squinting at the engraving. "Time reveals all things. What is this, some kind of family heirloom?" "It was my father's," Grace said quietly. "Please give it back." Something in her voice had changed. Not louder, quieter, if anything. But there was a weight in it now that hadn't been there a moment before. Brett didn't hear the warning in it. Or he heard it and decided it didn't matter, because nothing anyone in that diner said had ever mattered to him before. He held the watch up higher, out of her reach, grinning at his friends. "Bet it's not even real silver," he said. "Bet Daddy stole it from a pawn shop." "Give it back," Grace said again. The whole diner had gone still now. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Rosie had come out from behind the counter, moving fast, but she was still 10 feet away. Frank had already started to rise from his booth, old instincts firing before his mind had fully caught up. Brett looked at the watch one more time, then let it drop. It hit the tile floor with a small, sharp sound and skidded a few inches under the table. The diner was silent enough that everyone heard it land. For a moment, nobody moved. Grace looked down at the watch on the floor. Then she looked up at Brett. There was no anger on her face, no panic, just a kind of stillness that was somehow more unsettling than either would have been. She knelt down slowly and picked it up with both hands, checking it over like a nurse checking a patient's pulse. The glass face was cracked, a thin line running from corner to corner. She closed her hand around it gently and stood back up. "You okay?" Brett said, mocking, not really asking. "Or you gonna cry about your little watch?" Grace looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only the nearest tables could hear it clearly. "You still have a chance to step back from this," she said. "I'd take it, if I were you." Brett laughed, loud, performative, playing to his friends. "Is that a threat?" From the waitress? It's not a threat, Grace said. It's a fact. Most people only get one warning. You're welcome to yours. For just a second, something flickered across Brett's face. Not fear exactly. More like confusion. The kind that comes when someone doesn't react the way the script says they should. Then he laughed it off, shook his head, and dropped a few crumpled dollar bills on the table. More than enough to cover the coffee, not nearly enough to cover what he'd broken. Whatever, he said. Come on, guys. He and his friends walked out, the bell over the door ringing behind them, cheerful and completely out of place. The diner exhaled all at once. Rosie reached Grace first, hand on her shoulder. Honey, are you all right? I am so sorry. I should have said something sooner. I'm fine, Grace said, and she sounded like she meant it, which was somehow the strangest part of all. She slipped the broken watch back into her apron pocket, carefully, the way you'd tuck a photograph of someone you missed. Then she picked up her tray and went back to work, like nothing at all had happened. Frank Merritt stayed in his booth a while longer that morning, coffee going cold in front of him. He'd seen a lot of things in 3 decades of police work. He'd seen people scared into silence. He'd seen people explode with rage the second someone crossed them. He had never, not once, seen someone absorb a moment like that with the kind of stillness Grace had just shown. That wasn't a woman who didn't feel anger. That was a woman who had learned, somewhere, at some cost, exactly how to control it. People don't learn that kind of control waiting tables. They learn it somewhere much harder. Frank didn't say anything to her that day. It wasn't the moment for questions. But he made a decision, sitting there with his cold coffee, that he was going to start paying closer attention. Something told him Grace Doyle was carrying more than a broken pocket watch into that diner every morning. And something told him that sooner or later, Millbrook Falls was going to find out exactly what that was. There was another regular at Rosie's that Frank often shared a nod with, a man named Harold Boone, 71 years old, a widower who came in most days for lunch, simply because eating alone at home had grown too quiet for him. Harold had served in the Army decades earlier, then spent the rest of his working life fixing tractors for half the farms in the county. He'd watched the coffee incident from 2 tables away, and he'd watched it the way most people in that diner had, uncomfortable, silent, unwilling to be the one who spoke first. Later that afternoon, when the lunch crowd had thinned, Harold caught Grace near the register and cleared his throat. I should have said something, he told her, turning his cap over in his hands. Back there, with that Calloway boy. It wasn't right what he did. You don't owe me an apology, Grace said gently. None of this is your fault. Maybe not, Harold said, but silence has a way of making a man feel like it is. Grace looked at him for a moment, something soft passing behind her eyes. My father used to say something like that, she said. He said the worst thing a good person can do is nothing, while they wait for someone braver to go first. Harold nodded slowly, like the words had settled somewhere he needed them to. Sounds like a smart man, he said. He was, Grace said quietly. I miss him every day. Harold didn't ask any further questions. He simply reached into his wallet, left a tip far larger than his lunch required, and told her he'd see her tomorrow. Small kindnesses like that didn't undo what Brett Calloway had done, but they reminded Grace, in a town full of strangers, that not everyone chose to look away, and that mattered more than she let herself admit out loud. The diner had quietly returned by then to the ordinary business of feeding a small town its lunch. The rest of that week passed quietly, at least on the surface. Grace kept working her shifts, kept arriving 20 minutes early, kept her orders perfect and her voice even, no matter who sat down in front of her. But the town had noticed the coffee shop incident. Small towns always notice. By Friday, half of Millbrook Falls had heard some version of what happened, most of them exaggerated. A few of them softened out of habit, the way people soften stories about the Calloways, without even meaning to. Ellen Prescott heard about it from her hairdresser on Saturday morning. Ellen was 63, a retired schoolteacher, the kind of woman who still corrected people's grammar out of pure reflex, and then apologized for it immediately after. She'd lived in Millbrook Falls her whole life, taught 2 generations of the town's children in the same 4th-grade classroom. She came into Rosie's diner that afternoon, ordered a slice of apple pie she didn't especially want, and asked for the quiet new waitress by name, even though she'd never met her before. Grace brought the pie over, set it down gently. I heard what happened Thursday, Ellen said, not unkindly. I wanted you to know not everyone in this town is like that boy. Grace paused, tray against her hip. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. My grandfather used to say something, Ellen went on, looking down at her pie instead of at Grace, the way people do when a memory catches them off guard. He said the measure of a town isn't how it treats the powerful. It's how it treats the ones who can't fight back. Something shifted behind Grace's eyes, quick, almost invisible. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man, she said quietly. He was, Ellen said. We lost him a long time ago. Car accident out on Route 9. Never really got closure on how it happened. Some things in this town just get filed away, if you understand what I mean. Grace was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like recognition, like she understood loss without closure better than most people could. Ellen looked up at her, studying her face for a second longer than was polite. You have kind eyes, Ellen said. Tired, but kind. It's a rare thing these days. Grace didn't quite know how to answer that, so she simply nodded and went back to her other tables. But she thought about it for the rest of her shift. Some things in this town just get filed away. She'd heard a version of that sentence before, a long time ago, from someone whose voice she still remembered in her quietest moments. It was the kind of sentence that stayed with you, whether you wanted it to or not. Thomas Calloway rarely came into Rosie's diner himself. He preferred the steakhouse on the edge of town, the one with the private back room where deals got made over bourbon instead of coffee. But his presence was felt everywhere in Millbrook Falls, even when he wasn't in the room. His name was on the sign outside the new senior center. His company had repaved half the roads downtown. The mayor owed her last 2 elections, at least in part, to donations that came through Calloway Construction. People spoke of him the way people speak of weather. Something powerful, something you learned to live around, something you didn't argue with, because arguing with weather never got you anywhere. Frank Merritt knew Thomas Calloway a little differently than most. They'd grown up in the same town, gone to the same high school, though a few grades apart. Frank remembered a version of Thomas from decades ago, before the money, before the buildings with his name on them. Back then, Thomas had been just as hungry, just as certain the world owed him something, but without the power yet to make people agree with him. Power hadn't changed Thomas Calloway, Frank often thought. It had simply given him room to become exactly what he'd always wanted to be. And Brett, it seemed, was following the same path his father had cleared for him, except he'd started with the money already in hand, which meant he'd never had to learn a single lesson about earning anything at all. Frank didn't know yet how deep that particular rot went in the Calloway family. He would soon enough. But that Saturday, sitting in his usual booth, all he knew was that a young waitress with tired, kind eyes had just been humiliated in front of half the town, and nobody, including him, had done a thing to stop it. That sat with him more than he wanted to admit. He was a retired police chief. He'd spent his whole career believing that protecting people was worth something. Watching from a booth while a young woman got humiliated over a broken watch didn't feel like protecting anyone. It felt like exactly the kind of silence he used to lecture rookie officers about. The following Wednesday, Brett Calloway came back. It was later in the evening this time, closer to 9, when the dinner crowd had thinned out and only a handful of tables remained occupied. He came in with the same 3 friends, louder than before, the smell of beer already on them. Rosie clocked them the second the bell rang, and her shoulders tensed the exact same way they had the week before. I've got this table, she said quietly to Grace, moving toward them before Grace could even respond. It's fine, Grace said. I can take it, Grace. Rosie, it's fine, I promise. Rosie hesitated, then nodded, though the worry didn't leave her face. She'd seen a lot of new employees over the years. She'd never seen one who insisted on walking straight back into a fire the way Grace just had. Brett's group settled into the same corner booth, boots up again, voices too loud for the size of the room. Well, look who it is, Brett said when Grace approached with menus. The girl with the sob story watch. What can I get you tonight? Grace said, voice even, professional, giving him nothing to grab onto. Relax, Brett said, grinning at his friends. We're just messing around. Right, guys? His friends laughed the practiced laugh of people who'd learned it was safer to agree with Brett Calloway than to say what they actually thought. Grace took their order without engaging further and turned to walk back to the kitchen. Frank wasn't there that night. He'd gone home early, some ache in his knee acting up in the cold. He would spend a long time afterward wishing he'd stayed. The order came up 20 minutes later. 4 plates, hot off the grill, balanced on a large round tray that Grace lifted with practiced ease. She carried it the way she carried everything. Low center of gravity, steps quiet and even, the tray riding smooth despite its weight. She was 3 steps from the table when Brett stood up, supposedly to head to the restroom, and stepped directly into her path. It happened fast. His shoulder caught the edge of the tray, hard, clearly intentional. The kind of shove that looks accidental to anyone who isn't watching closely. For most people, that moment would have ended one way. Plates crashing to the floor. Hot food everywhere. Grace on the ground, humiliated in front of the whole diner one more time. That is not what happened. What happened next took less than a second and a half. Grace's body reacted before her mind had finished registering the shove at all. Her right foot slid back into a low, balanced stance. Her hips dropped. Her free hand shot up under the tray, catching it flush, absorbing the impact in one smooth, controlled motion. Not a single plate slid. Not a single drop of gravy spilled over the edge. At the same time, without seeming to think about it at all, she pivoted her upper body just enough to let Brett's shoulder pass harmlessly beside her, instead of colliding with her the way it was supposed to. The whole thing happened so fast, so cleanly, that for a moment the diner didn't even register what it had just seen. Then the silence hit. Brett stumbled forward a step, off balance from a collision that hadn't actually connected the way he'd expected, catching himself against the edge of the booth. He turned around, face flushed, and stared at Grace. She stood exactly where she'd been, tray steady in both hands, 4 plates of food perfectly intact, not a hair out of place. Her expression hadn't changed at all. "Your table's ready," she said quietly, and set the tray down on the stand beside her, beginning to serve the plates one at a time, like nothing unusual had happened. Nobody in that diner moved for a long moment. An older couple near the window had frozen mid-bite. The cook had come out from the kitchen to see what the noise was, and stood in the doorway, dish towel still in his hand. Rosie stood behind the counter, mouth slightly open, staring at Grace like she was seeing her for the very first time. Brett's friends exchanged a look, the kind of look people give each other when something doesn't fit the world they think they understand. "What was that?" one of them muttered. Brett straightened his jacket, trying to recover some version of his composure. "Watch where you're going," he snapped at Grace, voice rougher than before, less certain than before. "I did," Grace said simply, setting the last plate down in front of him. "Enjoy your meal." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, the same even pace she always used, like nothing at all had happened, like her heart wasn't hammering just beneath the surface of that perfect calm. Brett sat back down slowly, staring after her, something new and unfamiliar sitting uneasily behind his eyes. He didn't understand what he'd just seen. Nobody at that table did. But there is a particular kind of stillness that only comes from training, from repetition, from a body that has learned through years of discipline exactly how to move when everything happens too fast for conscious thought to keep up. That is not a stillness you learn by accident. You learn it because someone, somewhere, taught you that hesitation could cost you your life. Rosie found Grace in the back a few minutes later, restocking napkins with hands that were for the first time all night trembling just slightly. "Grace," Rosie said softly. "What was that?" Grace didn't turn around right away. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have let you take the table." "That's not what I'm asking," Rosie said. "Honey, I've run this diner for 31 years. I have never seen anyone move like that, not once." Grace finally turned, and for just a moment, something raw flickered across her face before the careful calm settled back into place. "I used to have a job that required quick reflexes," she said carefully. "It's a habit I never fully lost." "What kind of job requires reflexes like that?" Grace looked at her for a long moment, weighing something Rosie couldn't see. "One I'd rather not talk about right now," she finally said. "I hope that's all right." Rosie studied her for a long moment, the same way a mother studies a daughter who has just come home with an unexplained bruise. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "But Grace, I want you to know something. Whatever you're carrying, whatever's behind you, you're safe here. This diner has looked out for people longer than that Calloway boy has been alive." Something in Grace's shoulders loosened, just slightly at those words. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." Out in the front room, Brett Calloway finished his meal in near silence, his friends unusually quiet around him. He paid the check, left no tip, and walked out without another word to anyone. But he glanced back once through the window at the young waitress moving between tables like nothing unusual had ever happened. Something about that calm bothered him more than any argument could have. He didn't know why yet. He would find out, in time, and by then it would already be far too late for him to change course. 2 booths away, a pair of retired farmers had watched the whole thing unfold over their pie. "That boy's going to get himself in real trouble one of these days," one of them muttered, once the bell above the door had stopped ringing. "His daddy will clean it up," the other said. "Always does. Man's got half the town in his pocket one way or another. Doesn't make it right. Never said it did. Just said it's how it works around here." They went back to their pie after that, the way people in small towns often do, naming a truth out loud and then quietly setting it back down, unwilling to carry it any further than the conversation required. Rosie overheard it from behind the counter, and nothing, though her jaw tightened in a way that Grace was beginning to recognize. It was the look of someone who had watched this pattern play out for years and hated every bit of it, and had never quite found the courage or the leverage to change it. Grace filed that look away, too, the same careful way she filed away everything else in this town. She was starting to understand exactly what kind of place she had walked into. A good town, full of good people, sitting quietly under the weight of one family's money and one family's name. It wasn't so different, in its own way, from other places she had once worked. Places where the people in charge counted on silence to protect them. Places where the truth eventually found a way out anyway, no matter how long it took, or how many people tried to bury it. Word of what happened that Wednesday night spread through Millbrook Falls the way small-town stories always do, quietly at first, then all at once. By the weekend, half the diner's regulars had heard some version of it, most of them getting the details slightly wrong, a few of them getting them exactly right. Frank Merritt heard about it Thursday morning, from Rosie herself, over his usual eggs and black coffee. He listened without interrupting, the old investigator in him cataloging every detail, every word choice, every small piece of the story that didn't quite fit the shape of an ordinary waitress. When Rosie finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, stirring his coffee slowly, though he took it black and didn't need to stir it at all. "You remember anything else about her application?" Frank asked. "Anything at all? Even something small?" Rosie thought about it. "Not much. She said she'd waited tables a long time ago. Didn't say where. No references from the last couple years. I almost didn't hire her. But you did." "There was something about her," Rosie said. "I don't know how to explain it. Like she needed a chance more than she needed a job." Frank nodded slowly, looking out the window at Main Street, at the town he'd spent his whole life protecting. He thought about the way Grace always sat facing the door. He thought about the scar he'd once glimpsed on her forearm, quickly covered again, before he could be sure he'd really seen it. He thought about the way she'd caught that tray, the way her body had moved on pure instinct, faster and more precise than anything a person picks up waiting tables in a small-town diner. And he thought about the pocket watch, and the words engraved across its worn silver face. He'd heard that name before. Doyle. Somewhere, a long time ago, buried under 3 decades of other names in other cases. He couldn't place it yet. Not fully. But something about it kept tugging at the edge of his memory, the way an old case file does when you know you're missing a piece you used to have. Frank finished his coffee, left his usual tip on the table, and stood up slower than he used to, the years finally starting to show in his knees if nowhere else. "Rosie," he said before he left, "do me a favor. Keep an eye on that girl. Something tells me there's a lot more to her story than any of us know yet." "I already figured that much out myself," Rosie said quietly. Frank nodded and walked toward the door. He paused there for a moment, hand on the handle, looking back across the diner at Grace, who was refilling coffee for the 2 retired school teachers in the corner booth, laughing softly at something one of them had said. She looked, in that moment, like exactly what she appeared to be. A quiet young woman, working an honest job, trying to build some kind of peace for herself in a town that didn't ask too many questions. Frank had learned a long time ago not to trust appearances completely. Not because people were usually hiding something terrible. Most of the time, They were simply carrying something painful, something they weren't ready to put down in front of strangers yet. He suspected that was closer to the truth with Grace Doyle. But he also suspected, walking out into the cold morning air, that whatever she was carrying had teeth, and sooner or later, in a town like Millbrook Falls, where the wrong people held too much power for far too long, those teeth were going to show themselves. That night, alone in her small apartment above the old feed store, Grace sat at her kitchen table with the broken pocket watch open in front of her. She held a small screwdriver in one hand, carefully working at the cracked glass, replacing it with practiced, patient movements. On the wall behind her hung a single photograph, worn at the edges, of a man in uniform, kind-eyed, steady-jawed, an arm around a little girl no older than 9 or 10. Grace looked up at it sometimes while she worked. "You'd have liked this town, I think," she said quietly, to no one, to the photograph, to the memory that never quite stopped talking to her. Good people. Slow to notice things. Slower to say them out loud. She set the new glass carefully into place and closed the watch with a soft click. "But they're starting to notice now," she said, just like you always said they would. She wound the watch gently and listened to it begin to tick, the words engraved on its face catching the lamplight for just a moment before she slipped it back into her pocket. Time reveals all things. Her father used to say that line often, usually right before explaining some piece of evidence that had taken months, sometimes years, to finally come to light. Grace had learned, over the course of her whole life, exactly how true it was. Some truths took days to surface. Others took 15 years, buried under money and power, and a town too afraid to ask the questions that mattered. She closed her hand around the watch, feeling the familiar weight of it settle against her palm. Whatever happened next in Millbrook Falls, she was no longer just passing through. She had a reason for being here, a reason with her father's name attached to it. And for the first time since she'd arrived, 3 weeks and 1 broken watch ago, Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile. Because somewhere in this quiet little town, without knowing it yet, people had just started asking exactly the right questions. All she had to do now was wait for the answers to catch up. Outside her window, the streetlights of Millbrook Falls flickered on one by one, the same way they had every night for as long as anyone could remember. Somewhere across town, Brett Calloway was already telling a different version of the story, one where he was the one who'd been embarrassed, one where the quiet waitress had somehow started it. His father would hear that version first. His father usually did. And somewhere else in town, in a modest house near the edge of the county road, Frank Merritt sat awake a little longer than usual that night. An old case file box pulled down from a closet shelf, dust thick across the lid. He hadn't opened it in years. He wasn't ready to open it yet, but he set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long while, the same way a man looks at a door he isn't sure he wants to walk through. Because somewhere in the back of his memory, a name kept surfacing, quiet and insistent, refusing to let him sleep. Doyle. He had heard it before. He was almost certain of it now. And if he was right, then the quiet young woman refilling coffee cups at Rosie's diner wasn't just carrying grief, or old training, or a habit of watching doors. She was carrying a piece of something this town had buried a long time ago. Something that had never been properly laid to rest. Patience is a strange kind of strength. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for applause. It simply waits quietly for the moment when it finally matters. Grace Doyle had learned that lesson long before she ever set foot in Millbrook Falls. Now it seemed an old retired police chief was about to learn it too, one dusty file at a time. Some towns get lucky. The truth finds them gently, in its own good time. Other towns have to be shaken awake first. Millbrook Falls, without knowing it yet, was about to find out which kind of town it really was. Every town keeps its secrets in different places. Some bury them in old newspaper archives, yellowed and forgotten in a back room. Some bury them in silence, passed down through raised eyebrows and half-finished sentences. And some bury them in a cardboard box, sitting on a closet shelf for 15 years, waiting for someone brave enough, or stubborn enough, to finally open the lid. Millbrook Falls had done all three. It had buried its secrets in dusty archives, in careful silence, and in the quiet guilt of people who had chosen, year after year, not to ask the questions that mattered. That is how most small towns survive in the end. Not because nothing bad ever happens in them, But because the people who live there learned to look past it, gently, politely, for the sake of keeping the peace. Sometimes that peace is worth protecting. Other times, it is simply the sound silence makes while it waits to be broken. Frank Merritt sat at his kitchen table that night, staring at exactly that kind of box. He hadn't touched it in years. He wasn't sure even now that he was ready to. But a young waitress with a broken pocket watch had just walked into his quiet retirement, and something told him he didn't have much choice left in the matter. Frank lifted the lid slowly. Dust rose in the lamplight, thick and undisturbed. Inside were folders, old case notes, photographs curling slightly at the edges, the last physical trace of an investigation that had never truly ended, only stopped. He found the folder near the bottom, exactly where he remembered leaving it. The name on the tab was faded but still legible. Doyle, Marshal, Federal. Frank sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. 15 years fell away in an instant. He remembered now. Not everything, not yet, but enough. A quiet man in a gray coat, methodical, careful, asking questions that made powerful people in this town very uncomfortable. A man who had come to Millbrook Falls to look into Calloway construction and never left it alive. Frank opened the folder and began to read. It took him most of the night. Page after page, he read through interview notes he'd half forgotten writing, statements from workers too frightened to go on record, a trail of financial irregularities that had been flagged and then quietly dropped, over and over, always right before it reached anyone with enough power to act on it. He found his own signature at the bottom of a closing report, the one that had officially ended local involvement in the case. He didn't remember signing it feeling right, even at the time. He remembered feeling like a man handing off a problem he didn't have the authority to keep carrying, and telling himself that was the same thing as doing his job. It wasn't the same thing. He understood that now, with the particular clarity that only comes 15 years too late. By the time he closed it again, the sky outside his window had already started to lighten, and something heavy had settled into his chest, the particular weight of a truth he should have chased harder a long time ago. He picked up the pocket watch photograph the department had taken back then, a simple evidence photo, silver casing, worn edges, an engraving too small to read clearly in the old print, but he didn't need to read it again. He already knew what it said. To D. Doyle. Time reveals all things. Frank closed the folder, and for the first time in 11 years of retirement, he felt something close to purpose settle back into his bones. He picked up the phone and called Rosie's diner before it had even opened for the morning. "I need to talk to Grace," he said, somewhere quiet. "Today, if she's willing." Grace agreed to meet him that afternoon, after her shift ended, at a small park near the edge of town where the benches faced a slow-moving creek instead of a street. She arrived exactly on time, apron folded neatly in her bag, hair still pulled back tight from work. Frank was already there, the old case folder resting on his lap, though he hadn't opened it yet. "Thank you for coming," he said, as she sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful, deliberate distance between them. "You said it was important," Grace said. "You don't seem like a man who exaggerates." Frank allowed himself a small, tired smile at that. 32 years wearing a badge in this town," he said. "You learn not to waste people's time with small things." He set the folder down on the bench between them, but didn't open it yet. "I want to ask you about your father," he said. "And I want you to know, before I do, that I'm not asking as a stranger fishing for gossip. I'm asking because I think I owe him something I never finished." Grace's whole body went very still. "What do you know about my father?" she said quietly. "His name was Daniel Doyle," Frank said. "He was a federal marshal. 15 years ago, he came to this town investigating a construction company for fraud, money laundering, falsified permits, kickbacks to local officials, all of it tracing back to one family." He paused, watching her face carefully. "Calloway Construction," he said. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was something raw underneath the calm she usually wore like armor. "He never came home from that assignment," she said. "They told my mother it was a car accident. Black ice, a bad curve, no other vehicles involved. She never believed it, neither did I." "Neither did I," Frank said quietly. "Not really. Not even back then." He opened the folder finally and turned it toward her, showing her the old photographs, the sparse notes, the investigation that had been quietly closed within 6 weeks of Daniel Doyle's death. I was a detective on this force back then, Frank said. I worked the accident scene the night he died. Something never sat right with me about it. The skid marks, the angle of impact. It didn't match the official story, not clean enough. But the case got closed from above before I could push any further. I was told very clearly that federal matters weren't local business. And you let it go, Grace said, not unkindly, just stating the fact plainly. I let it go, Frank admitted. I've regretted it every year since. I told myself there wasn't anything more I could do. That's the excuse people use when they're more scared than they want to admit. Grace looked down at the photographs for a long moment. He used to tell me something. When I was young, she said quietly. He said the truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people want it to. It just waits. Sometimes longer than we'd like. Time reveals all things, Frank said softly, reading the words from the old evidence photo. He believed that with his whole heart, Grace said. I've spent a long time trying to believe it too. They sat in silence for a while after that, the creek moving quietly below them, neither one in a hurry to fill the space with more words. A pair of mallards drifted past on the current, unbothered by the two people on the bench, and for a moment Frank found himself envying them, the simple, uncomplicated business of just floating along with the water instead of fighting it. Why did you come to Millbrook Falls? Frank finally asked. After all this time, Grace considered the question carefully before answering. I spent years training for a job that required exactly the kind of discipline you've probably already noticed, she said. I'm not ready to tell you everything about that yet. But when the chance came to request an assignment near this town, I took it. I needed to see the place where he died. I needed to understand what really happened to him before I could let any of it rest. That's not really an answer, Frank said gently. It's the only one I can give you right now, Grace said. I hope that's enough, for the moment. Frank studied her for a long time, the same careful, patient way he used to study witnesses who were telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Let me ask you something else then, he said. That night with the tray, the way you moved, that wasn't luck and it wasn't waitressing instinct. I've watched a lot of people move under pressure in my life. I've never seen anyone move like that who didn't have real training behind it. Grace was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. My father wasn't the only one in our family who believed in doing hard things for the right reasons, she said carefully. After he died, I made some choices about how I wanted to spend my life. Choices that required a certain kind of discipline. I'm not able to tell you everything about that yet. Some of it isn't only my story to share. Fair enough, Frank said. I've kept plenty of things close myself over the years. I won't push where it isn't welcome. It's enough, he said finally. For now. He closed the folder and handed it to her. I think you should have this, he said. It belongs to you more than it belongs to me. Grace took it carefully, both hands, the way she'd once taken the watch off the diner floor. Thank you, she said. For keeping it. For not letting it disappear entirely. I should have done more than keep it, Frank said. But I'm willing to do more now, if you'll let me help. Grace looked at him for a long moment, weighing something behind her eyes. I think I will, she said quietly. I think I might need someone in this town who already knows how deep this goes. News like that has a way of finding its way to exactly the person who needs to hear it. A couple of days later, Ellen Prescott stopped by Grace's table again, this time not for pie, but with a folder of her own tucked under her arm. She waited until the lunch rush thinned, then asked Grace to sit with her for a moment, if she could spare it. Rosie waved her on from behind the counter, understanding without needing to be told that this was a conversation that mattered. Frank called me yesterday, Ellen said, once Grace had settled into the booth across from her. He told me a little about your father, about what happened to him 15 years ago. Grace nodded carefully, unsure yet where this was heading. My grandfather died that same year, Ellen said. Same road, if you can believe it. Route 9, just past the old mill bridge. They called it an accident, too. Struck while walking home from a town council meeting, one he wasn't even supposed to be at that late. Grace felt something cold settle low in her chest. What was your grandfather's name? She asked quietly. Arthur Prescott, Ellen said. He used to work part-time for the county records office. He'd found something in the permit files that didn't add up, something involving Calloway Construction's early projects. He mentioned it to a few people before he died. Never got the chance to mention it to the right ones. She opened the folder she'd brought, sliding it gently across the table. Inside were old newspaper clippings, brittle and yellowed, along with a handwritten letter in careful, looping cursive. "I found this years later going through his things," Ellen said. "He wrote it not long before he died. Never sent it. I think he ran out of time." Grace read the letter slowly, the words of a man she'd never met, describing irregularities in construction permits, false inspection reports, money that moved through the county in ways it shouldn't have. At the bottom, in the same careful handwriting, was a single line that made Grace's breath catch. "Spoke with Marshal D about this. He agrees something serious is happening. We plan to meet again next week to compare notes." "They knew each other," Grace said softly. "My father and your grandfather. They were working on the same thing." "I believe so," Ellen said. "I believe that's exactly why neither of them lived long enough to finish it." The two women sat together for a long moment, two separate griefs quietly recognizing each other for the first time. "I'm sorry," Grace finally said, "for your loss. I understand it now, more than I did before." "I'm sorry for yours too," Ellen said. "It seems we've both been waiting a very long time for someone to take this seriously." "Someone is taking it seriously now," Grace said, a quiet steel settling into her voice. "I promise you that." Ellen reached across the table and gently squeezed Grace's hand. "Then let an old school teacher help however she can," she said. "I may not know how to fight, but I know how to remember things clearly and how to write them down so other people remember too." "That might matter more than you realize," Grace said. "In my experience, the people who win these things aren't always the strongest ones in the room. They're the ones who kept the clearest record of what actually happened." Ellen smiled faintly, the first real smile Grace had seen from her. "My grandfather used to say something close to that," she said. "He said a town's memory is only as honest as the people willing to write things down and refuse to forget them." "He sounds like he would have liked my father," Grace said. "I think they would have gotten along just fine," Ellen said. Two stubborn men trying to do the right thing in a place that didn't always want to hear it. That, Grace was learning, might turn out to be exactly the kind of weapon this town needed most. The town council announcement went up on the community board outside the post office not long after, printed on official letterhead, the Calloway construction logo stamped discreetly in the corner. A public hearing had been scheduled, 6 days out, regarding the renewal and expansion of Calloway Construction's development permit for the old mill property on the edge of town. Buried deep in the fine print, in language most residents would never bother to read closely, was a clause authorizing the county to formally archive and seal any records older than a decade related to prior development disputes, citing storage costs and administrative efficiency. Frank read that clause 3 times before he fully understood what it meant. Any lingering paper trail connecting Calloway Construction to old permit fraud, old financial irregularities, anything reaching back far enough to touch the deaths of Daniel Doyle and Arthur Prescott, would be sealed away within the county system, effectively unreachable, the moment that hearing passed. 6 days. That was all the time Millbrook Falls had left before 15 years of buried truth became legally permanently unreachable. The notice didn't make much noise at first. Most residents walked past the community board without a second glance, the way people do with anything printed in small type in official language. But word moved through the diner differently than it moved through a bulletin board. Within a day or two, half the regulars at Rosie's were talking about the upcoming hearing over their coffee. Most of them focused on the new development itself, the jobs it might bring, the tax revenue the town council kept promising. Almost none of them had read past the first paragraph to the clause tucked quietly near the bottom. Frank made it his business to change that. He spent a couple of mornings that week sitting in his usual booth with a photocopy of the notice spread out beside his plate, walking anyone who'd listen through exactly what that sealing clause would mean, in plain terms, without the legal language designed to make people's eyes glaze over. Some listened closely. Others waved him off, telling him he'd been retired too long and was looking for trouble where there wasn't any. Frank didn't mind being dismissed. He'd been dismissed before and been right anyway. He brought the notice to Grace himself, laying it flat on the diner counter after closing one evening, Rosie standing close by, arms crossed, reading over his shoulder. "They're not just protecting Brett anymore," Frank said grimly. "They're protecting everything. All of it permanently, if this hearing goes through. Then we have 6 days to find something that can't be sealed away," Grace said quietly. Something real. Something they can't argue with in a room full of people who trust the wrong name too easily. What did you have in mind? Rosie asked. Grace looked down at the notice for a long moment. There's a man named Walter Higgins, she said. I've heard his name mentioned twice this week, always carefully, always in a low voice. He used to keep the books for Calloway Construction years ago before he retired. I remember Walter, Frank said slowly. Kept to himself, even back then. Left the company rather suddenly, if I recall right. People who leave suddenly usually leave because they saw something they weren't supposed to see, Grace said. I'd like to talk to him. Be careful how you go about that, Frank warned. If Brett's father gets even a whiff that someone's stirring up the old accounting records, this town could get a lot more dangerous than a broken pocket watch. I've been careful my whole life, Grace said simply. I don't intend to stop now. Rosie watched her go that evening with a worried crease still lodged between her brows. She had run this diner for 31 years, and in all that time, she had learned to trust her own instincts about people faster than most. Her instincts told her Grace Doyle was one of the most honest people to walk through that door in a long while. But honesty, Rosie also knew, had never once stopped a Calloway from getting what he wanted in this town. She said a quiet prayer that night, something she hadn't done in years, that whatever Grace was walking toward, it wouldn't cost her more than she was prepared to pay. Walter Higgins lived alone in a small house at the edge of town. Surrounded by an overgrown garden, he no longer had the energy to tend properly. He was 66 years old, thin, quiet, the kind of man who had learned, decades earlier, that some knowledge was safer left unspoken. Grace found him the very next afternoon, off shift, dressed plainly. No apron, no reason for anyone watching to think this was anything more than a friendly visit. He answered the door cautiously, studying her for a long moment before finally stepping aside to let her in. You're the waitress everyone's been talking about, he said, settling into a worn armchair across from her. The one with the watch. News travels fast in a small town, Grace said. Faster than most people realize, Walter said. What can I do for you, Miss Doyle? Walter's living room was small and tidy, though it carried the particular stillness of a house lived in by only one person for a very long time. A single photograph sat on the mantel. A younger Walter in a suit, standing beside a woman Grace guessed had once been his wife. You lost someone, Grace said gently, noticing where her gaze had drifted. My wife, Ruth, Walter said. 10 years now. She used to tell me I carried too many secrets for one man's shoulders. I think, near the end, she was right about that. I'm sorry, Grace said. Don't be, Walter said. It's part of why I never left this town, even after everything. Her garden is out back. Someone has to keep tending it. Grace nodded, letting the silence settle for a moment before returning gently to the reason she'd come. You knew my father, Grace said. Daniel Doyle. He was investigating Calloway Construction 15 years ago, right around the time you left the company. Walter's hands tightened slightly on the arms of his chair. I wondered if someone would eventually come asking about that, he said quietly. I'd hoped it might happen while I was still around to answer honestly. Will you? Grace asked gently. Answer honestly, I mean. Walter was quiet for a long moment, staring at the worn carpet beneath his feet. I kept 2 sets of books for that company for almost 4 years, he finally said. One for the auditors, one for the truth. I told myself I was just doing my job, keeping records the way I was told to. It took me a long time to admit that made me part of it, whether I liked it or not. Do you still have those records? Grace asked carefully. I do, Walter said. I've kept them hidden for 15 years. Told myself I was waiting for the right moment. Truth is, I was mostly just scared. You don't have to be scared anymore, Grace said. Not if you're willing to let me help you. Walter studied her for a long moment, the same careful weighing Frank had done on that park bench days earlier. Your father was a good man, he finally said, one of the only honest ones who ever came asking questions in this town. I've carried guilt for 15 years, wondering if my silence helped get him killed. Then let's make sure his death wasn't for nothing, Grace said quietly. Bring me those records, Mr. Higgins. Let's finish what he started. Walter agreed to meet her again soon, once he'd had time to retrieve the ledgers from where he'd hidden them, and once his nerves had settled enough to trust his own decision. Grace left his house that afternoon with the first real thread of hard evidence this investigation had touched in 15 years. She should have known better than to think Brett Calloway would simply let his own humiliation go unanswered in the meantime. Brett had spent the past week nursing a wound that had nothing to do with his body, and everything to do with his pride. The whole town had seen that tray incident. Every version of the story that circulated made him sound smaller, clumsier, less in control than he'd ever allowed himself to feel before. He needed badly to reclaim the upper hand. He found his opportunity in his cousin Doyle, who worked odd hours as a delivery driver, and who occasionally lingered around the diner's back entrance while waiting on shipments. "She's alone back there most nights, closing up the register," Doyle mentioned one evening, more out of idle observation than any real scheme. "Rosie trusts her with everything already." Brett turned that piece of information over carefully, the way a man turns over a tool he's decided to use for something it was never meant for. He thought about the tray. He thought about the way half the diner had looked at him afterward, like he was the one who'd embarrassed himself instead of the other way around. He thought about his father's voice, the one he'd heard his whole life, telling him that a Calloway never lets an insult go unanswered. Not because it mattered, but because letting it go made you look weak in front of people who needed to keep believing you weren't. A plan began forming, ugly and petty, in exactly the way Brett's plans usually were. If he couldn't humiliate Grace with words anymore, he could humiliate her with an accusation instead, one that would cost her the one thing she seemed to genuinely care about in this town: her job, her place at Rosie, the fragile trust she'd built with people who mattered to her. It didn't take much. A little cash pulled from the register during a distracted moment. A quiet word passed to Rosie's bookkeeper about discrepancies noticed in the weekly totals. A suggestion, carefully worded, that maybe the new girl wasn't quite as trustworthy as everyone assumed. Within days, $300 had gone missing from the diner's cash drawer, and the only person whose shift schedule matched every single missing entry, according to the doctored records Brett had quietly arranged, was Grace. The bookkeeper who first noticed the discrepancy was a mild, unassuming woman named Carol, who did the diner's books part-time from a small office 2 doors down. She had no idea her weekly reconciliation sheet had been quietly tampered with before it ever reached her desk. A few numbers shifted, a few dates adjusted, just enough to point in a single, convenient direction. Carol brought her findings to Rosie in good faith, apologetic and uncertain, the way honest people usually are when they stumble into something ugly without meaning to. Rosie called Grace into the back office before the lunch rush, her face tight with an apology she hadn't even voiced yet. "I don't believe it," Rosie said immediately, before Grace could even ask what was wrong. "I want you to know that first. But the numbers, Grace, they don't look good. Someone's raised a formal concern, and I have to take it seriously, for the sake of the business." Grace sat very still, processing the accusation with the same careful calm she brought to everything else. "I understand," she said quietly. "What happens now?" "I have to suspend you, pending a review," Rosie said, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "I am so sorry. This isn't me believing you did anything wrong. This is me trying to protect this diner while we figure out what actually happened." "I know," Grace said. "You're doing the right thing, given what you're seeing." "I don't want you to think I've turned on you," Rosie said. "I don't think that," Grace said gently. "I think someone wanted exactly this to happen and used the numbers to make sure it did." Rosie's eyes widened slightly. "You think this was deliberate?" "I think there's a very short list of people in this town who benefit from me losing my footing right now," Grace said. "And I think we both already know who's near the top of that list." Word of Grace's suspension moved through Millbrook Falls even faster than the story of the tray had. This time, the story didn't favor her. A few of the regulars, the ones who'd never fully warmed to a newcomer anyway, nodded along knowingly, as if this confirmed something they'd suspected all along. Others simply grew quieter around her, uncertain, unwilling to take sides in something that felt bigger than a diner dispute. That was perhaps the hardest part of it all for Grace, not the accusation itself. She had weathered far worse accusations than this in a different life under far higher stakes. It was watching a handful of people she'd only just begun to trust take one small step backward, unwilling to be the ones who said out loud that something about this didn't add up. She understood it, even as it stung. Trust takes longer to build than 3 weeks of good coffee and correct orders. But understanding it didn't make the quiet any easier to sit inside. Harold Boone was one of the few who didn't waver. He came in for his usual lunch, found Grace's booth empty, and asked Rosie directly, in a voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear, whether anyone had actually looked at the timing of those missing funds, or simply assumed the newest employee was the easiest one to blame. Rosie didn't have a good answer for him. Neither, for that matter, did anyone else. Grace spent those difficult days doing exactly what her training had taught her to do under pressure. She stayed disciplined. She stayed quiet. She didn't waste energy defending herself loudly to people who had already made up their minds. Instead, she used the unexpected free time to dig deeper. She spent hours at the small county records office, cross-referencing old permit filings with the notes from her father's case folder, piecing together a financial pattern that stretched back further than even Frank had initially realized. The clerk at the front desk, patient older man named Gerald, who had worked there for nearly 30 years, grew curious about her repeated visits, and eventually curious enough to help. "You're looking for the same thing that old Marshall was looking for years back," he said one afternoon, sliding a dusty box of older filings across the counter to her. "I remember him too. Quiet fella. Polite. Asked good questions nobody wanted to answer." "Did you help him?" Grace asked. "As much as I could back then," Gerald admitted. "Wasn't much. I was younger, had a family to think about, a mortgage that depended on staying employed. I've thought about him more than a few times since. Wondered if I could have done more." "You can help now," Grace said gently. "That still counts for something." Gerald nodded slowly, and from that day on made sure every relevant file found its way quietly into her hands. He wasn't the only one, it turned out. A retired court clerk named Vernon, who Gerald introduced her to over coffee one afternoon, remembered the case too, and produced a set of old permit approvals, stamped with a signature that didn't match the inspector who was supposed to have signed them. Piece by piece, the 15-year-old picture was coming back into focus, sharper than it had ever been allowed to be, while the people who could confirm it were still too frightened to speak. She met with Walter Higgins again, this time in the quiet of his garden, going over the ledgers page by page, learning the shape of a fraud that had been carefully built, brick by brick, over more than a decade. "This is enough to end them," Walter said quietly, watching her study the final page. "If it ever sees daylight, it will," said. "We're going to make sure of that." Walter looked at her for a long moment, something like hope flickering behind his tired eyes for the first time in years. "There's someone else who should see these before the hearing," he said. "Someone at the county office who still owes me a favor. I want to get copies made, somewhere safe, away from prying eyes." "When?" Grace asked. "Tonight," Walter said. "Better sooner than later, with that hearing coming up so fast." "I'll go with you," Grace said. "You shouldn't have to carry this alone, not after 15 years of doing exactly that." Walter's eyes grew a little damp at that, though he blinked it away quickly, embarrassed by his own emotion. "Your father would be proud of the woman you turned into," he said quietly. "I only knew him a short while, but I remember thinking he was the kind of man this town needed more of." "Let's make sure this town finally gets what it needed," Grace said. 15 years late is still better than never. He arranged to meet a trusted contact after dark at a small copy shop 2 towns over, far enough from Millbrook Falls that no one would think to watch for him there. Grace offered to walk him partway, an offer he gratefully accepted, unused as he was to carrying this kind of weight entirely alone. They set out just after sunset, ledgers wrapped carefully in an old canvas bag slung over Walter's shoulder, the autumn air sharp and cold around them. Neither of them noticed the car that had been parked, quiet and unlit, near the corner of Walter's street for the better part of an hour. Brett hadn't ordered this personally. He'd simply mentioned, offhand, to a couple of men his father sometimes used for less official errands, that Walter Higgins had been seen meeting with the new waitress, and that it might be worth finding out why. What those men decided to do with that information was, in the end, entirely their own choice. They caught up to Walter and Grace 3 blocks from his house, where the streetlights thinned and the road curved away from any watching windows. One of them stepped directly into their path. "Evening," he said, voice deliberately casual, hand resting a little too visibly near his jacket pocket. "Mr. Higgins, we need to have a word about that bag you're carrying." Walter froze, color draining from his face. Grace stepped forward slightly, placing herself between Walter and the man without seeming to hurry at all. "He doesn't have anything that concerns you," Grace said evenly. The second man circled around from behind, closing the distance quickly, clearly expecting no resistance at all from an unarmed waitress and a frightened old accountant. "Hand over the bag," the first man said, "and nobody has to make this difficult." "It's already difficult," Grace said quietly. "You just haven't realized that yet." What happened next took less than 8 seconds, though it would feel, to Walter, like it stretched on much longer. The man behind Grace lunged first, reaching for her shoulder to pull her aside. She moved before his hand ever landed, pivoting smoothly, catching his wrist and redirecting his own momentum into the side of a parked car. Controlled, precise, no wasted motion at all. The first man rushed forward, and Grace met him low, sweeping one leg out from beneath him before he'd even fully registered what had happened to his partner. He hit the pavement hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, and Grace was on him instantly, pinning his arm at an angle that made resistance genuinely painful without breaking anything. "Stay down," she said quietly, voice utterly calm, as if she were simply asking him to wait his turn at a counter. "I promise you this is the gentle version of how this could have gone." The second man, groaning against the car, tried to rise again and thought better of it the moment he saw the flat, focused look in her eyes. For a fraction of a second, the street was completely silent, nothing but the distant hum of a passing car somewhere blocks away, and the ragged breathing of two men who had badly misjudged exactly who they were dealing with. Walter stood frozen against the wall, canvas bag clutched to his chest, staring at Grace like he was seeing an entirely different person than the one who had been carefully reading his ledgers in the garden that same afternoon. A porch light flicked on across the street. An elderly neighbor, drawn out by the sound of the scuffle, stood on her front step, phone already in hand, watching the entire scene unfold in stunned silence. Grace held the man down a moment longer until she was certain neither of them intended to escalate further, then stepped back carefully, putting herself once more between the threat and Walter. "Go home," she told the two men. "Tell whoever sent you that this ends tonight, or it doesn't end well for anyone involved." The men scrambled up, exchanged a shaken glance, and retreated quickly to their car, tires screeching faintly as they pulled away into the dark. Walter finally exhaled a long, shuddering breath and looked at Grace with something between fear and profound gratitude. "Who taught you to do that?" he whispered. Grace glanced across the street, at the elderly neighbor still standing frozen on her porch, phone lowered now, eyes wide with the same unspoken question. "That's a longer story than we have time for tonight," Grace said quietly. "Are you all right, Mr. Higgins?" "I think so," Walter said, voice shaking slightly. "I think for the first time in 15 years, I actually am." Grace helped him steady the bag over his shoulder, glanced once more at the empty street where the car had disappeared, and guided him gently onward toward the meeting he still needed to keep. "Are you certain you're all right to keep going tonight?" she asked him quietly, once they'd put a few more blocks behind them. "I've never been more certain of anything," Walter said, some of the color returning to his voice along with his steps. "For 15 years I told myself I was too old, too tired, too frightened to finish what your father started. Tonight I learned I'm apparently still capable of walking straight into danger for the right reason. That's worth something at my age." "It's worth quite a lot," Grace said, allowing herself a small, tired smile. "Let's get those copies made, Mr. Higgins. We're almost there." Behind them the porch light stayed on for a long while. The neighbor did not go back inside right away. She stood there instead, replaying what she had just witnessed, already knowing, in the quiet way small towns always know these things, that she had just seen something she would end up repeating to someone else before the week was through. Word like that doesn't stay contained for long. Not in a town where everyone already suspected the quiet new waitress was carrying more than anyone had bothered to ask about. By the time Grace and Walter reached the copy shop 2 towns over, made their copies, and started the long drive back toward Millbrook Falls, something had already begun shifting beneath the surface of the town they'd left behind. Somewhere in a house with too much money and not nearly enough conscience, a phone call was already being made. Somewhere else, an old retired police chief sat awake once more, sensing, without yet knowing why, that the time remaining before that hearing had just become far more dangerous than he'd originally feared. Frank had spent 32 years learning to read a town's temperature before it fully understood itself. He could feel this one rising, The kind of pressure that builds quietly for years, and then, all at once, demands somewhere to go. He thought of Grace, out there somewhere in the dark, carrying a burden that had once belonged to her father alone. He thought of Walter, finally unburdening 15 years of silence in a single, frightened, courageous night. He thought of Ellen, and her grandfather's unfinished letter, and all the other quiet names in this town who had learned, one painful lesson at a time, that speaking up came with a cost. Frank intended to make sure that whatever came next, this town would not spend one more day pretending it hadn't seen the truth standing right in front of it. He would learn about the incident on Walter's Street the next morning, not from Grace, who wouldn't have mentioned it unprompted, but from the elderly neighbor herself, who stopped him outside the hardware store, still visibly shaken, still trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. "That young woman from the diner," she said. "The quiet one. I saw her take down 2 grown men last night like it was nothing at all, moved like she'd done it 100 times before." Frank listened carefully, asked a few gentle questions, and thanked her for telling him. He walked the rest of the way home slower than usual that morning, turning the pieces over in his mind. A federal marshal's daughter, trained, disciplined, careful beyond her years, investigating the same family that had likely orchestrated her father's death. It wasn't hard, once you laid it out plainly, to guess what kind of work Grace Doyle had spent the last several years doing. Frank didn't ask her directly. He suspected, correctly, that some answers needed to arrive on their own timeline. But he understood with sudden and total clarity that the town of Millbrook Falls was no longer simply hosting a quiet young waitress with a sad story. It was hosting someone who had been trained, formally and thoroughly, to finish exactly the kind of fight her father never got the chance to. And somewhere across town, in a house that had never once had to answer for anything, the Calloway family was about to discover precisely what that meant. And somewhere in between, a woman who had spent years learning exactly how to disappear into stillness now found herself standing, quite suddenly, in the full and unwelcome light of attention. "Time reveals all things," her father used to say. It was starting to, faster now than anyone in Millbrook Falls was fully prepared for. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a small town in the days before something important happens, whether the town knows it yet or not. People still go to work. Farmers still tend their fields. The diner still fills up every morning with the same familiar faces, ordering the same familiar meals. But underneath all of it, something shifts, almost imperceptibly, like the air pressure dropping before a storm nobody has forecast yet. Rosie noticed it in the way her regulars lingered a little longer over their coffee, murmuring in pairs about the upcoming hearing. Ellen noticed it in the careful, deliberate way she began organizing her grandfather's old papers, preparing herself for a conversation she'd waited 15 years to have. Walter noticed it in the strange, unfamiliar lightness in his own chest, the feeling of a burden finally being shared instead of carried alone. And Grace noticed it most of all, in the quiet, steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, the same discipline that had carried her through years of training, now carrying her toward the one fight she had always known. Somewhere deep down, she would eventually have to finish. 6 days had become 5. Somewhere out there, a man who had never once answered for anything in his life was about to discover exactly what it felt like when the truth finally arrived at his door. There is a moment in every long fight when it looks like the wrong side is about to win. Not because the truth has weakened, because the people defending it are tired and the people hiding from it still have money, and money has a way of buying just enough time to make good people doubt themselves. Millbrook Falls was about to reach that moment. 5 days remained before the town council hearing, and Thomas Calloway had just learned that 2 of his men had been handled in the middle of the night on a quiet residential street by a waitress from his son's favorite diner. He did not take that news calmly. Thomas Calloway had spent 30 years building a certain kind of peace in this town, not the honest kind, the kind that comes from making sure nobody with the courage to speak ever has the evidence to back it up. He had buried problems before, bigger ones than this. He intended to bury this one too. He had learned that lesson from his own father, decades earlier, a man who used to say that reputation was the only inheritance worth protecting, and that protecting it sometimes required doing things a man wouldn't want written down anywhere. Thomas had spent his whole life making sure nothing was ever written down. 15 years ago, that had meant a quiet word to the right people, a hurried investigation, a case closed before it could properly begin. This time, he told himself, pacing the length of his office that morning, it would simply require the same careful hand, applied a little more urgently. But burying a problem and burying the truth, he was about to discover, were not always the same thing. Thomas Calloway called Sheriff Nathan Briggs into his office the following morning, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. Briggs was 38, ambitious, and deeply aware of exactly how many campaign donations had come through Calloway Construction over the years. He had never done anything he considered truly criminal in his 3 years wearing the badge. He had simply learned, the way many people in this town had learned, that some questions were safer left unasked, and some names were safer left unchallenged. "I need this handled quietly," Thomas said, sliding a folder across his desk. "2 of my men were assaulted last night near Walter Higgins's place, unprovoked. I want the woman responsible taken in." Briggs opened the folder and found a hastily written statement from the 2 men, describing an attack that bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. "You're talking about the diner waitress," Briggs said slowly. "I'm talking about a dangerous individual who assaulted 2 innocent men on a public street," Thomas said. "I trust the sheriff's department can see the difference between that and whatever version of events she tries to tell you." Briggs hesitated, just for a moment. He had heard, the way everyone in town had heard by now, a slightly different account of that night, one that painted Grace as the one who had stopped an attack, not started one. But Thomas Calloway was still looking at him with the same patient, expectant expression he'd worn for 3 years, the one that always seemed to be reminding Briggs exactly whose support had gotten him elected. "I'll bring her in for questioning," Briggs finally said. "Good," Thomas said. "Make sure it sticks long enough to matter." He did not say what he meant by that clearly enough to be written down anywhere. He did not need to. Briggs understood exactly what was being asked of him, even without the words. Grace's suspension had been lifted 3 days earlier, once Carol had gone back through her own reconciliation sheets and finally noticed the small, tampered numbers she'd missed the first time, embarrassed but honest enough to march straight into Rosie's office and say so out loud. Grace was working her 2nd shift back when the sheriff's car pulled up outside Rosie's diner that afternoon. She saw it through the front window, and something in her chest went very still, the same practiced stillness that had carried her through every difficult moment since she'd arrived in this town. Briggs walked in slowly, hand resting near his belt out of habit rather than necessity, and asked to speak with her outside. The diner went quiet around them, forks pausing halfway to mouths, conversations dying mid-sentence, the same particular silence that had settled over the room the day Brett threw her father's watch to the floor. "Grace Doyle," Briggs said once they were standing on the sidewalk, "I need you to come down to the station. There's been a formal complaint filed against you." "What kind of complaint?" Grace asked, voice calm, steady, giving nothing away. "Assault," Briggs said. "2 men say you attacked them near Walter Higgins's residence 2 nights ago." "They attacked Mr. Higgins first," Grace said. "I stopped them. There's a witness who saw exactly what happened." "That's something you can explain at the station," Briggs said, not unkindly, though not especially convinced either. Rosie came rushing out from behind the counter, apron still on, face pale with alarm. "This is absurd," she said. "Nathan Briggs, you've known this girl for weeks now. You know she wouldn't attack anyone without cause." "I know what's been reported to me," Rosie, Briggs said. "I have to follow procedure." Grace looked at Rosie, and something calm and reassuring passed between them, the kind of look that didn't need many words. "It's all right," Grace said. "Let him do his job. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone tries to bury it under paperwork for a night." She went with him quietly, without resistance, the same disciplined composure she brought to everything, even as half the diner watched through the front window, uncertain, for the first time, exactly what to believe. Rosie stood on the sidewalk long after the sheriff's car had pulled away, apron still tied around her waist, hands trembling slightly at her sides. Harold Boone came out to stand beside her, resting a steady hand briefly on her shoulder. "She'll be all right," he said, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. "She shouldn't have to be all right," Rosie said quietly. "She should never have been put through this in the first place." "No," Harold agreed. "She shouldn't have." But this town's had a habit of asking good people to be all right with things they never should have had to accept. Maybe it's time that habit finally broke. Rosie looked at him for a long moment, something resolute settling into her tired eyes. Maybe it is, she said. News of Grace's arrest moved through Millbrook Falls faster than any story that had come before it. By evening, most versions of it had grown considerably worse than the truth, the way stories do when they pass through enough frightened, uncertain mouths. Some said she'd put 2 men in the hospital. Some said she'd been carrying a weapon. A few, encouraged quietly by whispers that seemed to trace back to people close to the Calloway family, suggested she'd been hiding something dangerous behind that quiet waitress smile the entire time. Harold Boone heard 3 different versions before lunch and grew angrier with each one. "This town has a short memory," he muttered to Rosie, over a cup of coffee he barely touched. Weeks ago she caught a tray of food without spilling a drop, and everyone called it a miracle. Now she's supposedly some kind of criminal. "People are scared," Rosie said quietly. "Scared people believe whatever's easiest to believe. Doesn't make it right," Harold said. "No," Rosie agreed. "It never does." Frank heard about the arrest within the hour from a former colleague still working at the station who felt uneasy enough about the whole thing to make a quiet phone call. He drove straight to the sheriff's department, badge retired but instincts fully intact, and sat in the small waiting area for over an hour before anyone would tell him anything. When Briggs finally came out to speak with him, Frank didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You and I both know this arrest doesn't hold up," Frank said. "There's a witness who saw the whole thing. An elderly woman, lives across the street from Walter Higgins. She'll tell you exactly what happened if you bother to ask her." "I'm following the complaint that was filed," Briggs said, a little defensive. "Filed by 2 men working for Thomas Calloway," Frank said. "Doesn't that strike you as worth a second look?" Briggs was quiet for a long moment, jaw tight, clearly caught between what he suspected was true and what he'd been asked to do about it. "I'll look into the witness statement," he finally said. "That's all I can promise right now." "That's a start," Frank said. "It's more than this town's given people in a long while." He drove home slowly that evening, the fields along the county road turning gold and gray in the fading light, and thought about all the years he'd spent believing that wearing a badge automatically meant doing the right thing. It hadn't always meant that. Not for him 15 years ago, when a federal marshal's death had been quietly closed without the questions it deserved. It wasn't meaning that now, for Nathan Briggs, caught between his own conscience and the comfortable arrangement he'd built his career on. Frank understood that struggle better than most. He simply hoped, driving home under that darkening sky, that Briggs would find his way to the right side of it faster than Frank himself once had. Grace spent that night in a small holding cell, calm, silent, using the stillness the way she'd been trained to, turning it into something useful instead of something frightening. She thought about her father, about the nights he must have spent doing exactly this kind of waiting, patient, certain that the truth would eventually outlast whoever was trying to bury it. She thought about the watch, sitting now in a small evidence bag somewhere down the hall, its glass freshly repaired, its ticking momentarily silenced. She did not think even once about giving up. By morning, Frank had arranged bail through a small-town lawyer he trusted, an old friend named Louis Camden, who had handled the diner's business affairs for years and owed Frank more than one favor from decades past. Grace walked out of the station just after 10, blinking against the bright autumn light, to find Frank waiting for her by his truck. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Frank said. "This town's got some ugly instincts to work through before this is over. I won't pretend otherwise." He was right. The days that followed were some of the hardest Grace had faced since arriving in Millbrook Falls. A few of the regulars stopped coming into the diner altogether. Others came in, but sat at different tables, requesting different waitresses, uncomfortable now with a woman they'd only recently begun to trust. Rosie never wavered, not once, but even she couldn't stop the quiet erosion happening around her, particular damage that rumor does to a reputation, slow and steady, like water working its way through stone. Grace bore all of it the same way she bore everything, with a composure that some mistook for guilt, and others, the wiser ones, recognized as exactly the opposite. A few nights after her release, a knock came at her apartment door, late enough that she'd already changed out of her uniform, the pocket watch resting, as it always did now, on the small dresser beside her bed. She looked through the window before answering, and felt something cold and familiar settle into her chest. Thomas Calloway stood on her doorstep, alone, hands in his coat pockets, wearing the same easy confidence he wore everywhere in this town. Grace considered, for a brief moment, not answering at all. Then she thought of her father, of every careful lesson he'd taught her about listening more than speaking, about letting people reveal themselves fully before you ever showed your own hand. She opened the door. "Mr. Calloway," she said evenly. "It's late for a visit. I won't take much of your time," Thomas said, stepping past her without waiting to be invited, surveying the small apartment with the faint distaste of a man used to nicer things. "I think you and I should have an honest conversation, woman to man. No lawyers, no complaints, no theatrics." "I'm listening," Grace said, crossing her arms, careful to keep the small dresser and the watch resting on it within easy reach without drawing his attention toward it. "You're clearly an intelligent young woman," Thomas said. "Intelligent enough, I hope, to understand that this town has a certain order to it, an order that's worked out well for a lot of people, myself included, for a very long time. An order built on fear," Grace said quietly. Thomas smiled, thin and humorless. "Order is order. It doesn't much matter what holds it together, as long as it holds." "It matters to the people it's crushed," Grace said. "It mattered to my father." Something flickered across Thomas's face then, brief but unmistakable, the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. "You think you're the first person to come digging around this town looking for justice," he said, voice dropping lower, colder. "Your father made the same mistake 15 years ago. Asked too many questions, got too close to things that weren't his business. We handled that quietly. We can handle this quietly too, if you're smart enough to take the hint." Grace kept her expression perfectly still, though inside, something sharp and cold settled into place, the confirmation she had spent 15 years waiting for, arriving finally in the ugliest possible way. "Is that a threat, Mr. Calloway?" she asked quietly. "It's advice," Thomas said, straightening his coat. "Take the hint, Miss Doyle. Leave this town the way you found it. Quiet." He left a few minutes later, satisfied, certain, utterly unaware of the small silver watch that had been listening, patiently, to every word. Grace stood alone in her apartment for a long time after the door closed, holding the watch gently in both hands, listening to it tick. Her father had always told her that patience wasn't about waiting quietly. It was about staying ready for the exact moment the truth needed somewhere safe to land. That moment, she understood now, was finally close at hand. 2 days later, sitting across from Frank at his kitchen table, she was ready to share what she'd been carrying. Meanwhile, Walter Higgins had gone quiet. 2 days after the attack outside his house, he called Frank briefly, voice strained, saying he needed to visit his sister out of state for a while, that things had gotten too heavy for him to carry so close to home. He didn't explain further. He didn't answer when Frank called back the following day. Frank recognized the pattern immediately, the particular fear of a man who had been quietly reminded, without needing to be told outright, exactly how much he still had to lose. "They got to him," Frank told Grace grimly over coffee at his kitchen table 2 days before the hearing. "Not with violence, probably. Just enough pressure to remind him he's still got a pension, a house, a quiet life he doesn't want to lose. Without Walter's testimony, the ledgers are still evidence," Grace said. "But they're weaker without the man who kept them standing behind every page." "I know," Frank said. "We need more than paperwork now. We need people willing to stand up in that hearing room and say, out loud, in front of the whole town, exactly what they know." Grace was quiet for a moment, turning something over carefully in her mind. "There's something else we might have," she said slowly. "Something I haven't told you about yet." She reached into her jacket and set the small silver pocket watch gently on the table between them. "When I repaired this, the night that boy broke it, I didn't just replace the glass," she said. "I built something into the casing. A small recording device, voice-activated. It's been with me every day since, running quietly whenever I've needed it to." Frank stared at the watch, something between disbelief and admiration crossing his weathered face. "You've been recording this whole time," he said. "Not constantly," Grace said. "I'm careful about when I use it. My training taught me that evidence gathered the wrong way can hurt a case as easily as help it. But there's one recording on here I think might matter more than anything else we've collected so far." "What is it?" Frank asked. Grace's expression grew more serious. A few nights ago, after I was released, Thomas Calloway came to my apartment, she said, alone, late. He thought he was simply intimidating a frightened young woman into leaving town quietly. Frank sat up straighter. He came to see you personally? He underestimated me, Grace said simply. People like him usually do. He said things that night he never should have said out loud, especially not in a room where the watch on my dresser was listening. She turned the small dial on the side of the watch case, and a tiny, tinny recording began to play. Frank leaned in close, listening carefully, his face growing darker with every passing second. Thomas Calloway's voice, unmistakable, arrogant, utterly certain of his own untouchability, filled the quiet kitchen, laying claim to 15 years of buried guilt in barely more than a sentence, then sliding into a cold, direct threat about exactly what would happen if Grace didn't leave well enough alone. Frank sat back slowly when it finished, exhaling a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That's a confession, he said quietly. Not a full one. Careful enough to leave himself some room. But it's enough, Grace. Combined with everything else we've gathered, it's enough. I know, Grace said. I've been waiting for the right moment to use it. I didn't want to show my hand too early. The hearing is in 2 days, Frank said. That's the moment. That's the room where this needs to be heard, in front of the whole town, not buried in some quiet legal proceeding where it can be argued away by expensive lawyers. I agree, Grace said, but we still need Walter. His ledgers only carry so much weight without the man who can explain them. Frank was quiet for a long moment, an idea forming slowly behind his eyes. There's someone else this town needs in that room too, he said. Someone from outside it. I still know a few people at the county prosecutor's office from my years on the force. A woman named Margaret Hale, district attorney now. She owes this town a hard look, whether Thomas Calloway likes it or not. I'll call her myself tonight and make sure she understands exactly what's been buried here. Do you think she'll come? Grace asked. She will, Frank said. Margaret Hale never did care much for men who thought their name put them above the law. I imagine she'll want to see this hearing for herself. He made the call that same evening, laying out the ledgers, the old case file, and the pattern of 2 deaths ruled accidents 15 years apart, until Margaret Hale agreed, quietly and firmly, to attend the hearing herself. And I'll make another call after that, Frank added. I think I know someone who might be able to help us reach Walter, wherever he's gone to ground. Ellen Prescott had spent the past several days doing exactly what she'd promised, quietly gathering every piece of her grandfather's memory that might still matter. She found, tucked in an old church directory from 15 years earlier, the name of a woman named Dot Sanders, a retired nurse who had once mentioned, briefly and nervously, seeing a strange car parked near the mill bridge the night Arthur Prescott died. Dot was 81 now, living quietly at the edge of town, and had never once been asked to formally repeat what she'd seen. Ellen visited her on a Tuesday afternoon, bringing a slice of pie from Rosie's as a gesture of goodwill. I always wondered if anyone would ever come ask me about that night, Dot admitted, hands folded carefully in her lap. I saw a car parked near the bridge, engine running, no headlights, right around the time your grandfather was struck. I told myself it probably wasn't important. I was scared, if I'm honest. Everyone knew whose company owned half the county back then. Would you be willing to say that in front of the town council? Ellen asked gently. It might matter more now than it ever has before. Dot was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the pie she hadn't touched. I'm 81 years old, she finally said. I don't have much left to lose by finally telling the truth. Yes, I'll come. Ellen thanked her, eyes damp, and left that afternoon carrying one more small piece of a truth that had been scattered across this town for far too long. She stopped by the diner on her way home, finding Rosie behind the counter, and set the small notebook where she'd written down Dot's account carefully on the counter between them. 15 years I taught this town's children to always tell the truth, no matter how hard it was, Ellen said. I'm starting to understand how much harder that lesson is to live by than it ever was to teach. You're living it now, Rosie said gently. That counts for something, maybe for everything. Ellen managed a tired smile. I hope Arthur would think so. I think he'd be proud of the woman asking that question, Rosie said. That alone tells me something. Frank's phone call to Walter's sister took longer than he expected, 3 attempts before anyone finally answered, and a careful, patient conversation before she agreed to pass along a message. Walter called back that same evening, voice tight with fear and guilt in equal measure. "I heard about Grace's arrest," he said, before Frank could even explain why he was calling. "I've been sitting out here telling myself I did my part already, that the ledgers speak for themselves." "They don't, Walter," Frank said gently. "Not without you standing behind them. This town needs to hear your voice, not just read your numbers." Walter was silent for a long moment. "I left because I was scared," he finally admitted. "The same kind of scared that kept me quiet for 15 years the first time." "I understand that," Frank said. "But I think you already know how that kind of silence ends up feeling, given enough time." Another long silence stretched across the line. "I'll be there," Walter finally said, voice steadier now than it had been in weeks. "Whatever it costs me. I owe that much to Daniel Doyle's memory and to my own conscience." He hung up the phone and sat for a long while on his sister's back porch, watching the evening settle over an unfamiliar yard. He thought about Ruth and what she would have said, watching him finally choose courage over comfort after all these years. She would have been proud, he decided. She had always believed he was a better man than his own fear allowed him to be. He packed his bag that same night and told his sister, with more certainty than he'd felt in 15 years, that he was finally going home to finish something. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the whole town look, deceptively, like nothing unusual was about to happen. The community hall filled quickly, folding chairs arranged in careful rows, the town council seated at a long table at the front, Thomas Calloway seated prominently in the second row, confident, composed, dressed in the kind of suit that cost more than most attendees' monthly wages. Brett sat beside him, arms crossed, wearing an expression that hovered somewhere between boredom and barely concealed unease. Grace sat near the back, beside Frank and Rosie, the pocket watch resting quietly in her jacket pocket. Ellen sat a few rows ahead, Dot Sanders beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap, and near the door. Arriving just minutes before the meeting began, breathless from the drive, stood Walter Higgins, canvas bag clutched tightly against his chest. The mayor called the meeting to order, and the early agenda moved quickly through routine business, budget updates, a discussion about new streetlights, nothing that hinted at the storm gathering quietly in the back of the room. Grace sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching the room the way she had once watched every room she'd ever entered, cataloging exits' faces, small shifts in posture that told her more than words could. She had spent years learning patience under far higher stakes than a town council meeting. Still, her heart beat a little faster than usual, waiting for the moment that mattered. Then the development permit item came up. Thomas Calloway rose smoothly, delivering a polished presentation about jobs, growth, and progress for Millbrook Falls, the ceiling clause mentioned only briefly, buried carefully within talk of administrative efficiency and modernized record-keeping. When the floor opened for public comment, Frank Merritt stood first. The room quieted. Out of long habit and old respect, the way small towns always quiet themselves for a man who once wore a badge with honor. "I served this town for 32 years, Frank began, voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. 15 years ago, a federal marshal came here investigating fraud tied to Calloway Construction. His name was Daniel Doyle. He died before he could finish that investigation, in what was ruled, very conveniently, an accident." A murmur moved through the room. That same year, Frank continued, Arthur Prescott, a records clerk who had uncovered irregularities in Calloway's early permits, died in a strikingly similar accident on the very same road. Thomas Calloway rose immediately, face carefully composed, voice smooth and dismissive. "With respect, Frank, these are old, thoroughly investigated tragedies," he said. "I understand grief can lead people toward conspiracy. But I won't stand here and let my family's name be dragged through unfounded accusations." "They're not unfounded," Ellen Prescott said, standing now beside Frank, voice trembling but clear. "My grandfather wrote a letter before he died, describing exactly what he'd found. And there's someone here today who saw something that night 15 years ago, and has carried the weight of her silence ever since." Dot Sanders rose slowly, leaning on her cane, and in a quiet but unwavering voice, described the car she'd seen parked near the mill bridge the night Arthur Prescott died. The room had gone completely silent now, save for the soft rustle of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Thomas Calloway's composure had begun just slightly to crack. An old woman's memory from 15 years ago proves nothing, he said. Sharper now, less controlled. This is a waste of the council's time. Then let's talk about something more recent, Walter Higgins said, stepping forward. Canvas bag lifted high enough for the room to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Thomas's face went pale for the first time all morning. I kept 2 sets of books for Calloway Construction. For nearly 4 years, Walter said, voice shaking but growing stronger with every sentence. One for the auditors, one for the truth. I have the real numbers here. Money moved through this company in ways that never should have been legal. I stayed silent for 15 years out of fear. I'm done being silent. The mayor called for order, though her own hands were visibly trembling as she reached for her gavel. Thomas Calloway rose fully now, anger finally breaking through the careful mask he'd worn his entire life. This is a coordinated smear, he said loudly, orchestrated by a waitress with a criminal complaint against her, currently out on bail for assault. Are we really going to let her friends turn a public hearing into a circus? That was the moment Grace stood. The room turned toward her, uncertain, some faces still wary from the rumors of the past several days. My name is Grace Doyle, she said, voice calm, carrying clearly across the silent room. Daniel Doyle was my father. I came to this town to understand what really happened to him. What I found instead was a pattern this town has been living under for 15 years, one built on fear and silence, and the assumption that people like Mr. Calloway would never have to answer for anything. She reached into her jacket and drew out the small silver pocket watch. A few nights ago, Thomas Calloway came to my apartment, she said. He thought he was intimidating a frightened young woman into leaving town quietly. He said some things he shouldn't have. I want the council, and everyone in this room, to hear exactly what he said. She set the watch on the small podium microphone and turned the dial. The recording began to play, tinny but unmistakably clear in the silent hall. Thomas Calloway's own voice filled the room, cold, certain, utterly damning. Your father made the same mistake 15 years ago. Asked too many questions, got too close to things that weren't his business. We handled that quietly. We can handle this quietly too, if you're smart enough to take the hint. The silence that followed was the heaviest the room had felt all morning. Every eye in the hall turned toward Thomas Calloway, whose face had gone the color of ash, his carefully constructed composure finally, completely gone. That's edited, he said, voice suddenly much smaller than it had been moments before. Taken out of context. There's no context that makes those words sound innocent, Frank said quietly, the whole room silently agreeing with him. For a long moment, nobody spoke at all. The silence stretched out, heavy and complete, broken only by the soft hum of the old ceiling fans turning slowly overhead. Then one by one, quietly at first, a few of the regulars from Rosie's diner began to stand. Harold Boone rose first, cap in his hands. I've known men like Thomas Calloway my whole life, he said, voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. Men who mistake other people's silence for agreement. I was silent too, the day that boy humiliated Grace Doyle in that diner over a broken watch. I won't be silent today. Beside him, 2 of the retired farmers who had once quietly gossiped over their pie about how the Calloways always got their way rose as well, nodding solemnly toward the front of the room. Carol, the diner's bookkeeper, stood next, voice shaking but clear. I want the council to know my reconciliation records were tampered with before I ever saw them, she said. I take responsibility for not catching it sooner. I won't take responsibility for staying quiet about it now that I have. Even Gerald, the records clerk who had spent 30 years quietly filing paperwork nobody wanted to look at too closely, rose from the back row, clearing his throat before adding his own account of the permit approvals with the mismatched signature. One by one, the room seemed to exhale together, years of careful, practiced silence finally breaking loose all at once. District Attorney Margaret Hale, seated quietly near the back of the hall since the meeting began, rose slowly, having heard more than enough to act on. Mr. Calloway, she said, voice calm and formal, I'd like to speak with you and your legal counsel immediately regarding the matters just raised in this hearing, along with the financial records provided by Mr. Higgins. Sheriff Briggs, standing near the side door, looked toward Frank for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his eyes. Then he walked forward, slowly, and placed a hand on Thomas Calloway's shoulder. "I think you'd better come with us, sir," he said, voice steadier than it had been in the sheriff's office days earlier, "given everything just presented here today." Thomas Calloway looked around the room, at the faces of neighbors he had spent 30 years quietly controlling, and found for the first time in decades that not a single one of them looked away from him. Brett sat frozen in his seat beside the empty space his father had just vacated, the color draining slowly from his own face as the weight of what came next began to settle over him. He would answer, in the weeks that followed, for his role in the frame-up against Grace, for orchestrating the attack on Walter, for a lifetime of small cruelties finally catching up to him all at once. The charges took shape slowly over the following months, worked out carefully by District Attorney Hale's office, methodical in a way that stood in sharp contrast to how quickly the Calloway name had once made problems disappear. Brett would eventually plead guilty to charges of conspiracy and witness intimidation, accepting a sentence that included real accountability for the first time in his life, along with a lengthy list of community service hours that would, ironically, place him under the direct supervision of people he had once looked down on without a second thought. Thomas Calloway's case would take considerably longer, tangled in financial records and old testimony that stretched back 15 years. But the foundation for it, the ledgers, the recording, the newly courageous witnesses, had all been laid that morning in the community hall and could not be quietly unlaid again. But in that moment, in that silent hall, all he could do was sit very still and understand at last exactly what it felt like to be the one everyone was looking at. The hearing dissolved into a kind of stunned, murmuring chaos after that, the mayor calling repeatedly for order that took several long minutes to arrive. The development permit was tabled indefinitely. The ceiling clause was struck from consideration entirely. The council unanimous in that decision, several of them visibly relieved to finally have a reason to say no to a name they'd been afraid to challenge for years. Outside, on the steps of the community hall, the town gathered in small clusters, talking in hushed, disbelieving voices about everything they'd just witnessed. Rosie found Grace first, pulling her into a fierce, tearful hug that neither of them seemed inclined to end quickly. "I never should have doubted you," Rosie said, "not for one single moment." "You were protecting your business," Grace said gently. "I understood that, even then." "That's a kinder answer than I deserve," Rosie said. Ellen approached next, Dot Sanders leaning gently on her arm, both women's eyes red from tears that had finally, after 15 years, been allowed to fall for the right reasons. "Thank you," Ellen said simply, unable to find any larger words for what she felt, for finishing what our fathers and grandfathers started. "We finished it together," Grace said. "That matters more than anything I could have done alone." Walter stood a little apart from the others, canvas bag still clutched to his chest, looking lighter than anyone had seen him look in years. 15 years, he said quietly, mostly to himself. 15 years I told myself I was too old, too tired, too scared to matter. Turns out it only took one honest morning to matter after all. Frank found Grace last, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching the town slowly begin to breathe again. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. "I only knew him a short while, but I know that much for certain." Grace looked down at the small silver watch still resting in her palm, its glass clean, its ticking steady once more. "He always told me time reveals all things," she said softly. "I used to think that was just something people said to make grief easier to carry. I understand it differently now." "How's that?" Frank asked. "It's not really about waiting," Grace said. "It's about staying ready for the moment the truth finally gets its chance. Someone has to be there to catch it when it finally falls." Frank nodded slowly, the old lines of his face softening into something close to peace. "Well," he said, "you caught it, Grace Doyle. Steadier than anyone I've ever known." Rosie stepped forward then, holding out her hand. "Come back to the diner," she said. "There's a booth by the kitchen door with your name on it, if you'll still have it." Grace looked around at the small crowd gathered on those steps, at the town that had doubted her and grieved with her, and finally, when it mattered most, stood up beside her. "I'd like that very much," she said. "I think I'm finally ready to stay somewhere for a while." That evening, the diner filled with more customers than it had seen in weeks, the whole town needing, it seemed, one familiar place to sit together and make sense of everything that had happened. The bell above the door rang almost constantly, familiar faces filing in. Some of them, the same people who had quietly stopped coming during Grace's suspension, returning now with the particular sheepishness of people who knew they owed an apology, even if they weren't sure exactly how to say it out loud. A few of them managed it anyway. An older woman named Peggy, who had switched to a different waitress the week of Grace's arrest, stopped by her table before leaving that night. "I'm ashamed of how quickly I believed the worst," Peggy said. "I hope you'll let an old woman make it up to you with better tips from here on out." Grace smiled, warmly, without a trace of bitterness. "You don't owe me tips, Peggy. Just the same kindness you'd want if it had been you sitting in that cell instead of me." "Fair enough," Peggy said, eyes glistening slightly. "I'll try to remember that, the next time this town gets ahead of itself." Harold Boone raised his coffee cup toward Grace as she passed his table, a small, respectful salute that needed no words to explain itself. Rosie placed the newly repaired pocket watch gently into Grace's palm as her shift ended, glass clean, chain polished, the engraving catching the last of the evening light. To D. Doyle, time reveals all things. Grace closed her hand around it and felt, for the first time since arriving in Millbrook Falls, that she was no longer simply carrying her father's unfinished story. She was finally quietly allowed to set it down. Frank stayed until closing that night, the way he rarely did anymore, nursing a second cup of coffee he didn't really need, simply because he wasn't ready yet to let the day end. When Grace finally untied her apron and sat down across from him, he studied her for a long moment, the same careful, weighing look he'd given her that first afternoon on the park bench. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Now that it's finished?" Grace considered the question seriously, turning the watch over once in her hands before answering. "I don't think it's ever really finished," she said. "Not entirely. But I think, for the first time in a long while, I get to choose what comes next, instead of just reacting to whatever comes at me." "And what do you choose?" Frank asked. "I think I'd like to stay," Grace said. "Wait tables. Learn people's names properly the way Rosie does. Maybe let this town teach me how to rest, for once, instead of just how to survive." Frank smiled, the tired, satisfied smile of a man who had finally watched an old debt get paid in full. "I think Millbrook Falls would be lucky to have you stay," he said, "for whatever that's worth." "It's worth quite a lot," Grace said quietly, "more than I expected. When I first walked through that door, winter came to Millbrook Falls the way it always did, slow at first, then all at once, frost creeping up the diner windows until Rosie had to keep a rag by the register just to wipe them clear for the morning regulars. By then, Thomas Calloway's trial had been set for the spring, the case built carefully around Walter's ledgers, Dot's testimony, and a recording that no expensive lawyer had managed to explain away. Brett spent his Saturdays that winter shoveling snow from the walkways of the senior center his father's company had once built, working alongside Harold Boone, who had volunteered, without much explanation, to supervise his hours personally. Neither of them talked much while they worked. Harold said, more than once, that some lessons didn't need many words, just enough time and enough cold mornings to sink all the way in. Ellen spent that winter helping the county reopen its old records, working alongside Gerald and a stack of files that had waited 15 years to be read properly. In the spring, the town would vote to rename the small park near the mill bridge in honor of Arthur Prescott and Daniel Doyle, a modest bench and a modest plaque, exactly the kind of quiet recognition both men would have preferred to anything grander. Walter's garden came back that spring too, the first real bloom it had seen in years, and he took to sitting out among it most evenings, telling anyone who asked that Ruth would have liked seeing it tended properly again. Grace stayed on at Rosie's diner through all of it, learning the names of regulars she hadn't known before, letting the rhythm of the place settle into her the way it had settled into Rosie decades earlier. Outside, the streetlights flickered on across Main Street, the same way they had every evening for as long as anyone could remember. But something in this town had shifted, gently and permanently, the way things do when a community finally finds the courage to stand up together instead of looking away. Some people walk into a small town like they've never had a past at all. Grace Doyle had walked into Millbrook Falls carrying more grief than most people carry in a lifetime, and had left, in the end, having taught an entire town something it had quietly needed to relearn. Kindness needs someone willing to protect it. Patience is not weakness. It is simply strength waiting quietly for the moment it finally matters. And truth, however long it takes, however many powerful people try to bury it, has a way of finding its way home, if enough good people are brave enough to help it along. Somewhere in this town, an old pocket watch would keep ticking for many years to come, carried now not as a burden, but as a promise kept. Somewhere in this town, a retired police chief would sleep a little easier, knowing he'd finally finished the case he once believed he'd have to carry to his grave unresolved. And somewhere in this town, every single morning, the bell above a diner door would keep ringing, welcoming in whoever needed a warm seat, a hot cup of coffee, and the simple, steady reminder that they mattered, no matter how quiet they happened to be. Millbrook Falls had finally learned to believe it.